Part 3 of writing a lesson plan. This is the last part. The most important part for this class, we're going to talk about how to assess students with disabilities. We're going to talk about students that are your English learners. And then the other most important part is the assessment part of your lesson plans, your informal and formal assessment. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about writing accommodations for students who may have a visual impairment, who may have a hearing impairment, who may be dyslexic, who may have Asperger's, who may be ADHD. It, it could go on and on, okay? So what you're going to do, for this unit is every lesson plan you're going to address one special needs accommodation and one EL accommodation. So whatever you're doing, if you're using a PowerPoint, and suppose you have a visually impaired student, what I'd like for you to do is pick the same accommodation, that same student, visually impaired, for all of your lesson plans, so that I can see how that you can adjust those accommodations related to what you're teaching and assessing and how you build your unit. Right? So if I pick visually impaired and I'm doing a PowerPoint, then maybe my student requires a hand copy with larger print. Okay, moving them to the front of the room really probably doesn't do that good. It might help, but really, how can you accommodate that learner? Okay, could you do it audio so that they can plug in earphones and hear? What is it that you could do to keep them involved but they can still learn? English language learner. If you've got an English language learner and you're doing PowerPoints, you may want to make sure you include pictures, photos, things like that that help them. You can let them use dictionaries to look up words in their native language. If there is a person that is speaking to them in the same language, then they can share their thoughts together. That helps them. Okay, so what is it that you can do to accommodate that learner? All right, and then when we get to the part of writing your test, we'll talk about some accommodations for testing. Okay. So the last part is assessment. So we talked about pre-assessment, but then the two biggest parts are formal and informal. So informal, how are you going to check their understanding of the lesson? We talked about this last week. Informal is anything not graded, okay? So how are you going to check that they're understanding? It can be walking around the room. It can be question and answering. It can be pair share. It can be working on their KWL charts. It can be journals, eye contact, whatever it is, okay? But for every lesson plan, you have to have some type of informal assessment every day. Formal assessment. You may not always have formal, and formal we talked about is grading. Anything graded. Graded. There will have to be some type of rubric or document for you to check that you formally assess them. So on the very first day of your unit, you may not have anything, and that's okay. So what you would simply say is objectives for day 1 will be assessed with unit assessment or with performance project or something along those lines, okay? So you don't have to test every single day, but if you're not, you need to alert me or whoever to know when those objectives will be formally assessed, because if you're teaching it, you've got to assess it. Otherwise, it's not relevant, like we talked about the purposes of assessment last Friday. Okay, so every day you have to have informal. And then every day you've got to address formal. So on day 2, you may do a worksheet and take it up for a grade, or you may have a quiz. Okay, when we start building our performance assessment, we're going to come back and reference that under formal assessment. So you may work on it along those days. You may work on it sometimes on Tuesday, some on Thursday. So on those days, you would want to reference the rubric that you're going to use to grade that performance assessment. Okay? If the only time you're going to assess those objectives is with your unit test, then that's all you have to say is objectives for this day, or objectives will be assessed with unit assessment. Okay, so the informal and formal really have to match what you're teaching, and then again, it can be simple, but it has to match those objectives. It has to be tied to something, okay, so that it all kind of loops together. All right, so one lesson plan following these guidelines, and I'm going to go back to Blackboard now, and I'm going to post a lesson plan, a sample lesson plan, and some objectives that are well written. And so when you come to class next Friday, you're going to bring a draft of your objectives and a draft of one lesson plan. Okay? If you have any questions, email me or post on Blackboard. Have a great Labor Day.